If you have followed true crime stories for years, you know there are some cases that seem to settle into silence. The headlines fade, the television cameras leave, families try to move forward. And then, sometimes without warning, a single new detail brings everyone back to the beginning. That is exactly what has happened in the death of Nancy Guthrie. In recent days, renewed attention has surrounded the investigation, after fresh reporting and public discussion raised new questions about what investigators already knew, what they were still examining, and whether the evidence points towards something much darker than many people first believed. One phrase has captured almost everyone's attention: murdered for hire. Those three words carry enormous weight. They suggest planning, they suggest money, and they suggest that the person responsible may never have intended to get their own hands dirty. But before anyone jumps to conclusions, it is important to separate confirmed facts from speculation. Much of what has recently circulated online is built around developing information, public records, and commentary. Some questions remain unanswered, and investigators have not publicly confirmed every theory being discussed. That is where our story begins. To understand why this case continues to draw attention, we need to go back to the beginning. Nancy Guthrie was known by friends and family as someone who valued routine. She maintained close relationships with those around her, enjoyed quiet moments at home, and, according to people who knew her, rarely invited unnecessary drama into her life. Nothing about her daily schedule suggested that danger was nearby. Like so many victims whose names eventually become known across the country, her life appeared ordinary until the day everything suddenly changed. When authorities first responded, the scene immediately raised questions. At first glance, some details appeared consistent with what investigators often encounter in suspicious deaths. Officers secured the area, interviewed witnesses, and began documenting every possible piece of evidence. But experienced detectives know that first impressions can be misleading. Small details often matter far more than dramatic ones. A misplaced object, a missing phone, an unexpected financial transaction. A conversation that seemed harmless days earlier, but suddenly becomes important. Investigators reportedly began collecting every available piece of information before reaching any firm conclusions. Family members struggled to understand how someone they loved could suddenly be gone. Neighbors gathered outside, watching police activity from a distance. Many assumed answers would come quickly. Instead, questions continued to grow. As investigators worked through the evidence, they began building a timeline. That timeline would become one of the most important parts of the investigation. Every phone call, every text message, every security camera, every person who crossed paths with Nancy during her final days. Records show that investigators often spend weeks, and sometimes months, reconstructing movements minute by minute. It is painstaking work, but it frequently uncovers patterns that are impossible to recognize at first. According to reports surrounding the case, detectives examined communication records alongside financial information. That immediately caught the attention of experienced investigators. Financial records can tell stories people never intended to reveal. Payments, withdrawals, transfers, unexpected purchases. Even cash withdrawals taken at unusual times can become significant once investigators compare them against everything else they have learned. At first, nothing publicly suggested an organized criminal conspiracy. Instead, authorities appeared focused on determining exactly who had contact with Nancy before her death. Friends were interviewed, relatives were interviewed, co-workers answered questions. People who had spoken with her only briefly also found themselves contacted by investigators. Each interview added another piece to an increasingly complicated puzzle. Then something unexpected happened. The investigation began attracting national attention. Well-known crime reporters started following developments closely, including journalist Brian Entin, whose reporting on high-profile criminal investigations has earned a large audience interested in careful documentation rather than sensational rumors. His coverage encouraged many viewers to revisit information that had already been made public while waiting for investigators to release additional details. For longtime followers of true crime, that pattern feels familiar. Sometimes the biggest development is not a dramatic courtroom moment. Sometimes it is simply renewed public attention that encourages people to re-examine evidence they may have overlooked before. As discussion continued, one topic repeatedly surfaced. Could this have been something planned? Not simply a spontaneous act, not an argument that escalated unexpectedly, but something arranged in advance. That possibility changed how many people viewed the investigation. Still, investigators were careful. Authorities understand that once words like murder for hire enter public conversation, speculation can spread rapidly. That is why experienced detectives typically rely on evidence rather than assumptions. Phone records, digital evidence, financial transactions, travel histories, surveillance footage, witness statements. Each piece has to support the others. If one element fails to fit, the entire theory may need to be reconsidered. According to available reporting, investigators continued following multiple avenues rather than committing publicly to one explanation. That approach frustrated some observers. People naturally want immediate answers, but homicide investigations rarely move that quickly. Some of the strongest cases are built slowly. Every interview is compared with previous interviews. Every timeline is checked again. Even seemingly insignificant inconsistencies can become important weeks later. Meanwhile, family members continued living with uncertainty. There is something especially difficult about waiting for answers that may not arrive for months. Every unexpected phone call creates hope. Every news report brings fresh anxiety. Every rumor circulating online becomes another emotional burden. Those closest to Nancy reportedly wanted facts, not speculation. That distinction matters, because when attention grows, so do rumors. Social media can spread claims around the world within minutes. Some are based on real documents. Others are based entirely on assumptions. Experienced investigators know the difference. They also know that public speculation sometimes complicates active investigations. Witnesses begin second-guessing their own memories. Potential jurors hear incomplete information. False narratives become surprisingly difficult to correct. That is one reason authorities often release only limited information while evidence continues to be examined. Even so, certain developments gradually became public. Investigators reportedly examined relationships surrounding the victim. They looked at personal connections, financial interests, recent disagreements, anyone who might have had reason to benefit from Nancy's death. This does not mean everyone interviewed became a suspect. Far from it. Most interviews simply help investigators eliminate possibilities. But detectives cannot know which conversation will become significant until every piece is assembled. That brings us to one of the most discussed aspects of this investigation: money. Whenever financial motives appear in a homicide investigation, experienced detectives immediately begin asking difficult questions. Who stood to gain? Were there insurance policies, outstanding debts, business disputes, inheritance issues, unexpected transfers? Many homicide investigations eventually reveal no financial motive at all. Others uncover complicated money trails that become central to the case. According to reports, investigators carefully reviewed available financial information while continuing to gather evidence from other sources. Again, that does not prove any particular theory. It simply reflects standard investigative procedure. Then another detail stood out: digital evidence. Modern investigations often depend heavily on technology: cell phone location records, messaging applications, search histories, cloud storage, vehicle tracking systems, home security cameras, doorbell cameras belonging to neighbors, fitness watches. Even ordinary household electronics can provide timestamps investigators later compare against witness statements. Every digital footprint has the potential to answer one question while creating three more. Imagine investigators discovering that someone claimed to be home all evening. Then location records place that same phone somewhere else. That inconsistency immediately demands explanation. Of course, phones can be left behind. Someone else can carry them. Technology alone rarely solves a homicide. It simply becomes another piece of a much larger picture. According to publicly available information, investigators continued assembling that picture carefully. No dramatic announcements, no sweeping conclusions, just steady investigative work. Meanwhile, public interest continued growing. Viewers searched for updates. Online communities analyzed court filings. Experienced journalists continued reviewing newly released documents whenever they became available. Brian Entin's reporting drew particular attention because many viewers appreciated his practice of comparing official records with public statements instead of relying solely on internet speculation. That approach reminded audiences that facts matter more than viral theories. Still, one phrase refused to disappear: murdered for hire. Where had that idea originated? Was it based on evidence, an investigative theory, court testimony, or simply public speculation that had grown larger with each retelling? Those questions remain important because words have consequences. Once people believe a certain narrative, it becomes difficult to separate confirmed information from repeated assumptions. Investigators know this. Prosecutors know this. Defense attorneys certainly know this. Every public statement can eventually appear inside a courtroom. That is why careful language matters. As investigators continued reviewing evidence, another challenge emerged: time. With every passing week, memories become less precise. Witnesses forget exact conversations. People confuse dates. Small details disappear. At the same time, forensic testing often requires patience. Laboratory examinations can take weeks or months, depending on workload and the complexity of the evidence. For families waiting for answers, those delays feel endless. But investigators understand that rushing can create mistakes that later threaten an entire prosecution. Better to proceed carefully than to risk overlooking something critical. And yet, despite the careful pace of the investigation, public curiosity only intensified. What exactly had detectives uncovered? Was there someone cooperating behind the scenes? Had financial records pointed investigators toward a particular suspect, or was the truth still hidden beneath thousands of pages of interviews, forensic reports, and digital evidence? Those were the questions many people continued asking. And as additional information slowly began emerging, the story became even more complicated than anyone first imagined. One newly examined detail would shift attention toward conversations that investigators reportedly considered especially important, opening a completely different line of inquiry that few outside the case had expected. As investigators continued working through thousands of pages of evidence, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not the kind of investigation that would be solved by a single fingerprint or one dramatic confession. Instead, detectives were trying to determine whether dozens of separate details pointed toward the same conclusion. That takes time. Every interview had to be compared against every phone record. Every financial transaction had to be matched against the timeline. Every statement had to be measured against physical evidence. Sometimes those pieces fit together perfectly. Sometimes they did not. That is where the investigation reportedly entered a new phase. According to publicly discussed records and reporting, detectives began placing greater attention on conversations that had taken place before Nancy Guthrie's death. On the surface, many of those conversations appeared ordinary. Friends checked in with one another. Family members discussed everyday plans. Appointments were made. Messages were exchanged. Nothing about those individual conversations seemed especially alarming. But homicide investigators rarely look at conversations one by one. They study patterns. Who suddenly stopped communicating? Who changed their routine? Who contacted someone unexpectedly? Who deleted messages? Who claimed not to remember conversations that phone records later showed had taken place? Questions like those often become more important than the conversations themselves. Investigators reportedly worked to reconstruct not only Nancy's final days, but also the weeks leading up to her death. That wider timeline can reveal gradual changes that are impossible to notice when looking at only the final 24 hours. For example, if someone suddenly begins making unusually frequent phone calls, detectives naturally ask why. If large sums of money begin moving between accounts, they ask why. If relationships appear to change unexpectedly, they ask why. Every why becomes another avenue to investigate. At first, many observers assumed that any important breakthrough would come from forensic evidence. DNA, fingerprints, ballistics. Those forms of evidence are certainly valuable, but experienced detectives often say that people leave behind more than physical evidence. They leave behind decisions. Those decisions can be just as revealing. Someone changes travel plans. Someone purchases a disposable phone. Someone withdraws cash instead of using a debit card. Someone suddenly becomes difficult to reach. Each action may have a perfectly innocent explanation, or several actions, viewed together, may suggest something entirely different. That was the challenge investigators reportedly faced. Not one suspicious event, a collection of events that needed to be understood in context. Meanwhile, public attention continued growing. Every court filing attracted new interest. Every interview generated fresh discussion online. Television networks revisited earlier reporting, while independent journalists continued examining available records. Brian Entin remained one of the reporters whose updates were widely shared because he consistently emphasized confirmed information over speculation. That distinction became increasingly important. The internet was filled with theories. Some suggested financial motives. Others focused on personal relationships. Still others believed investigators were quietly building a much larger case than the public realized. But theories are not evidence. Investigators know that. Jurors know that. Families hoping for justice eventually learn that as well. A convincing story is not enough. Every allegation must be supported by facts that can withstand scrutiny in court. That is why detectives continued moving carefully. According to reports, financial records remained an important part of the investigation. Money has a way of documenting human behavior. Unlike memories, bank records do not become confused over time. Transfers occur on specific dates. Payments leave trails. Electronic records can often establish where money came from and where it eventually ended up. Investigators reportedly examined whether any unusual financial activity occurred before or after Nancy's death. Again, reviewing financial records does not automatically indicate criminal conduct. It is standard investigative practice. Most financial reviews eliminate possibilities rather than confirm them. Still, whenever detectives devote significant attention to financial evidence, people naturally begin asking what they might have found. Then another issue emerged: electronic devices. Modern homicide investigations increasingly depend on information stored inside phones, computers, tablets, and cloud accounts. A single device may contain years of messages, photographs, location history, calendar appointments, voice recordings, internet searches. Sometimes investigators recover information that the owner believed had already been deleted. Digital forensic specialists can spend weeks examining one device. Every recovered file is cataloged. Every timestamp is checked. Every communication is placed into context. According to reporting, digital evidence continued playing an important role as investigators worked through the case. One recovered message may not prove anything by itself, but several messages viewed together can help establish intent, planning, or state of mind. That possibility became especially significant as discussions surrounding an alleged murder-for-hire theory continued circulating. It is worth pausing here to explain what investigators generally look for in cases involving alleged murder-for-hire arrangements. Contrary to television dramas, there is rarely one document labeled as a contract. Instead, investigators search for indirect evidence, unexpected payments, secret meetings, burner phones, third-party communications, promises, debts, requests that seem ordinary until later events give them new meaning. Most importantly, investigators seek independent evidence supporting each element. One witness is rarely enough. One payment is rarely enough. One suspicious conversation is rarely enough. The strongest cases are built from multiple sources that independently point toward the same conclusion. Whether that standard has been met in Nancy Guthrie's case remains something only the courts can ultimately determine. At the time many of these discussions gained momentum, numerous questions were still unresolved. That uncertainty did not stop public debate. In fact, it seemed to increase it. People began examining earlier news reports frame by frame. Old interviews were replayed. Statements that once appeared routine were reconsidered in light of later developments. That happens in many high-profile investigations. A sentence spoken months earlier can suddenly sound very different after new evidence emerges. Witnesses also experienced renewed attention. Individuals who had spoken briefly with investigators early in the case sometimes found themselves contacted again. That does not necessarily mean detectives doubted their original statements. Quite the opposite. As timelines become more detailed, investigators frequently return to witnesses with more specific questions. Someone may suddenly remember seeing a particular vehicle. Someone else recalls an unusual phone call. Another witness realizes that an event occurred on Tuesday rather than Wednesday. Small corrections can significantly improve the accuracy of the investigation. That would have been the end of it, but another detail stood out. Investigators reportedly examined whether certain individuals' public statements matched available records. Consistency matters. When someone tells the truth, small details may naturally vary over time, but the core account usually remains stable. When significant contradictions appear, detectives want to understand why. Sometimes the explanation is simple. Human memory is imperfect. Stress affects recollection. People genuinely confuse dates and times. Other times, inconsistencies require additional investigation. That process is routine. It should not automatically be interpreted as evidence of guilt. Still, when multiple inconsistencies begin appearing across several interviews, detectives understandably pay close attention. Throughout this period, Nancy's family continued waiting. For them, every day without definitive answers carried emotional weight. Birthdays arrived. Holidays passed. Family gatherings felt incomplete. The absence of someone you love is difficult enough. The uncertainty surrounding that absence can be even harder. Friends reportedly described the emotional strain of wanting justice while also avoiding speculation. They understood that public discussion could never replace verified evidence. That perspective deserves respect. Cases involving intense media attention often become difficult for families to navigate. Every television segment reopens old wounds. Every online rumor spreads fresh anxiety. Every new theory forces loved ones to relive painful memories. Meanwhile, investigators continue doing work that is rarely visible to the public. Hours inside interview rooms, long nights reviewing surveillance footage, detailed forensic analysis, meetings with prosecutors, consultations with specialists. Much of the most important investigative work happens quietly. It is not dramatic, it is methodical. As reporting continued, attention also shifted toward what prosecutors might eventually need if charges were pursued. Suspicion alone is never sufficient. Even strong suspicion. A prosecutor must believe the available evidence can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is an extraordinarily high legal standard. It exists for good reason. Every fact must be supported. Every witness may face cross-examination. Every document will be challenged. Every timeline will be tested. If allegations involve an organized plan or an alleged murder-for-hire arrangement, prosecutors typically seek evidence showing not only what happened, but why it happened and how different participants may have interacted. That often requires combining financial evidence, communications, witness testimony, and forensic findings into one coherent narrative. According to public reporting, investigators appeared to continue assembling exactly that kind of comprehensive picture. Whether every piece ultimately supported the same conclusion remained the central question. Then another development drew fresh attention. Individuals following the case noticed renewed activity connected with court proceedings and investigative updates. Even relatively routine procedural developments began generating headlines because so many people were closely watching the case. Some interpreted those developments as signs that investigators were nearing a major announcement. Others urged patience, reminding viewers that court processes often move slowly and deliberately. Both reactions reflected the intense public interest surrounding the investigation. Yet beneath all the discussion remained one simple question. What really happened to Nancy Guthrie? Was the answer already hidden inside thousands of pages of evidence waiting to be presented in court? Or was investigators' work still uncovering critical pieces that had yet to come together? Those questions would become even more significant as the case moved toward its next chapter, where the focus shifted from investigation alone to the legal consequences that could follow if prosecutors believed they finally had enough evidence to move forward. As the investigation continued, attention gradually shifted from what detectives were looking for to what prosecutors might eventually be able to prove. Those are two very different questions. Investigators are expected to pursue every reasonable lead. Prosecutors, on the other hand, must decide whether the available evidence meets the legal standard required to present a case in court. That decision is rarely made quickly. Every report is reviewed. Every interview is examined again. Every piece of physical and digital evidence is evaluated to determine whether it supports the larger picture or raises new questions that still need answers. In a case that has attracted widespread public attention, that careful review becomes even more important. The public may want immediate conclusions, but the legal system works at a different pace. According to publicly available reporting, authorities continued following established investigative procedures while avoiding broad public statements about theories that had not been confirmed in court. That approach can sometimes leave people feeling frustrated. After months of following developments, many want a simple explanation. But complicated investigations rarely offer simple answers. There are moments when evidence appears to point strongly in one direction. Then another witness is interviewed. A forensic result comes back. A document is reviewed. Suddenly, investigators have another piece to fit into the puzzle. That is why experienced detectives often caution against reaching conclusions too early. Brian Entin's reporting reflected that same approach. Throughout the investigation, he focused on confirmed developments, court filings, and official statements, rather than repeating every rumor circulating online. For many viewers, that made his updates especially valuable. They offered perspective, without claiming certainty where certainty did not yet exist. As discussions continued, the phrase "murder for hire" remained one of the most debated aspects of the case. It is an expression that immediately captures public attention because it suggests planning rather than impulse. But proving such an allegation requires far more than suspicion. Investigators would generally need evidence showing communication, intent, financial arrangements, or other actions connecting those involved. Each element would need to be supported by admissible evidence. That is why cases involving alleged murder-for-hire arrangements are often built slowly. Records, messages, financial documents, witness testimony, electronic evidence. Each source must support the others. If one important piece cannot be verified, investigators may continue searching rather than moving too quickly. Meanwhile, Nancy Guthrie's family continued living with the emotional weight of the investigation. For families affected by violent crime, there is rarely a single day when life suddenly returns to normal. There are reminders everywhere: a favorite chair, holiday traditions, photographs, birthdays, anniversaries. Ordinary moments become difficult because someone who should be there is missing. Many families also face another challenge. They must watch strangers discuss deeply personal events on television and across social media. Some conversations are thoughtful, others are driven by speculation. That can be painful. It is one reason many relatives of crime victims repeatedly ask the public to rely on verified information rather than internet rumors. The search for justice depends on facts. As the legal process continued, observers also began discussing what could happen if additional evidence emerged. Would there be new court filings? Would investigators release more information? Would witnesses be called to testify? Those questions remained open. Court proceedings often unfold over many months, sometimes even years. Each hearing may answer one question while raising another. Documents are filed, attorneys respond, judges consider motions. The public often sees only a small part of that larger process. Behind the scenes, investigators and prosecutors continue preparing for every possibility. That preparation includes anticipating challenges to evidence. Defense attorneys have an important role in the justice system. They examine every document, every interview, every forensic report, looking for weaknesses or inconsistencies. That process is not a flaw in the system. It is part of ensuring that every case is thoroughly tested before a verdict is reached. Strong evidence should withstand careful examination. Weak evidence should be questioned. That principle protects everyone. Looking back over the timeline, it is remarkable how many ordinary details eventually became important. A phone call that once seemed routine, a financial transaction that attracted little attention at first, a witness who remembered one additional conversation weeks later. These are often the kinds of developments that shape major investigations. Not dramatic surprises, careful, patient work. The public often remembers the arrest or the courtroom verdict. Investigators remember the months spent reviewing documents long after everyone else had gone home. That patient work is rarely exciting to watch, but it is often what makes the difference between unanswered questions and a case that can withstand legal scrutiny. Another lesson from this case is the role responsible reporting can play. High-profile investigations generate enormous interest. That creates pressure to publish updates as quickly as possible. Responsible journalists balance that pressure with the need for accuracy. Throughout the public discussion, viewers repeatedly searched for reliable information rather than speculation. That is one reason updates based on official records and verified court proceedings received so much attention. It reminded audiences that facts matter, especially when real families are living through unimaginable loss. There is also a broader reminder here. Modern investigations are very different from those of decades ago. Digital evidence has transformed how detectives reconstruct events. Cell phone records, security cameras, electronic payments, vehicle tracking systems. cloud backups. Each can provide information that simply did not exist years ago. At the same time, technology has created new challenges. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Edited video clips circulate widely. Unverified claims can be repeated thousands of times before investigators have an opportunity to respond. That makes careful reporting and careful viewing more important than ever. As of the latest publicly available information, aspects of the case continue to be discussed and examined through official proceedings and reporting. Where questions remain unanswered, it is important to acknowledge that uncertainty rather than fill the gaps with assumptions. The justice system depends on evidence presented in court, not on popularity or speculation online. For Nancy Guthrie's loved ones, the hope remains the same as it was from the beginning: to know exactly what happened, to see the facts presented openly, and, if the evidence supports it, to see those responsible held accountable under the law. For everyone following the case, it serves as another reminder that behind every headline is a real family whose lives changed forever. Long after television cameras move on, they continue living with the consequences. That is why stories like this continue to resonate, not because they are sensational, but because they remind us how important truth, patience, and justice remain. As more verified information becomes available through court proceedings or official investigative updates, the public picture may become clearer. Until then, separating confirmed facts from speculation remains the most responsible approach. We'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe high-profile investigations receive too much attention before all of the evidence is available? Or do you think public interest helps keep important cases moving forward? Share your perspective respectfully in the comments below. And if you appreciate thoughtful, fact-focused coverage of developing true crime investigations, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll continue following major cases and bringing you updates based on verified reporting as new information becomes available. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.